The battlefield was silent for a moment. Only the distant crackle of fire and the low hum of damaged machines could be heard. Smoke curled into the air, carrying the sharp smell of burnt metal and blood. She crouched behind a half-broken wall, her chest rising and falling fast. Her hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the fear that wrapped around her like a chain. Her name was Liara. She had fought for days without sleep, without food, without hope. Now her weapon was gone. Thrown aside when the last charge failed, her people were dead or captured, and she knew she was next. The enemy was moving through the ruins, their boots crunching on the rubble. Getting closer every second, she could hear their voices, cold, sharp, and certain. They were hunting her. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they would hear it. She gripped a piece of broken stone in her hand, knowing it would not save her. But unable to just sit and wait, she thought of her home, of her mother's voice telling her stories under the night sky. Those days felt like they belonged to another life. This was the end, and she knew it. A shadow moved between the smoke. She froze, eyes wide, waiting for the enemy soldier to step through. But the figure was tall, broader than any of the enemy, and carried a weapon unlike theirs. He moved like a predator, silent, controlled, dangerous. For a moment, she thought it might be another kind of enemy, worse than the first, and then she saw his face, a human. Her people had told her stories about humans, how they came from a death world where everything tried to kill them, how they fought without fear, how they were cold and merciless. The stories always ended in death. She didn't know if they were all true, but she had no reason to doubt them. Humans were dangerous. The man's eyes swept the ruins. He spotted her, and for a long second, they stared at each other through the haze. She tensed, ready for the shot, ready for pain. But instead of raising his weapon at her, he turned away, lifting it toward the sound of approaching footsteps, and then he fired. The noise was deafening. The enemy soldiers cried out as they fell. The human moved fast, every shot finding its mark. She had never seen anyone fight like that. He didn't miss, didn't hesitate, didn't even seem to breathe. Within moments, the last enemy in sight was down. Liara pressed herself against the wall. She didn't understand. Why would a human kill the enemy soldiers? Why would he save her? Slowly, he lowered his weapon and stepped toward her. Her pulse raced. This was it. She was unarmed, weak, and cornered. If he wanted her dead, she wouldn't be able to stop him. He stopped a few feet away. His gaze swept over her torn clothes, her bruised face, her trembling hands. She met his eyes, waiting for the cold words or the final shot. Instead, he said something she had not expected. "You're safe now." The words didn't fit in her mind. They didn't belong here. Not in this burning ruin, not from a human. Safe. How could she be safe? She didn't even know what that felt like anymore. He extended his hand toward her. She flinched, but he didn't move closer, just waited. His hand was steady, firm, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. There was no rush in his voice, no threat in his stance. Lyra's throat tightened. She had trusted no one for years. Not since the war began. Trust had been punished. Kindness had been a trick. Yet here was this human, standing between her and death, offering her something she had thought was long gone. For a moment, the battlefield disappeared. The fire and smoke faded from her mind, and all she could hear was the steady beat of her own heart. A strange warmth began to spread in her chest, something she could barely recognize. Hope. She didn't take his hand yet. She couldn't, not now, but the seed of it was there, planted. In the ashes of her fear, she knew the enemy would come again. They always did. And she knew this human could still be dangerous. But for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking only of dying. She was thinking about surviving. Liara kept her back to the broken wall, watching the human as if he might turn on her at any second. The smoke still clung to the air, but the battlefield had gone strangely quiet. The sound of boots and shouting was gone, replaced by the low crackle of fires and the distant hum of machinery. The human lowered his rifle and looked at her again. His face was unreadable, neither cruel nor friendly. His uniform was torn in several places, streaked with dirt and dried blood, yet he stood tall, like someone who carried the weight of battles without bending. "Can you walk?" he asked. His voice was deep but calm, not rushed, not harsh. She hesitated before giving a small nod. Her legs felt weak, her body heavy from exhaustion. But she forced herself to stand. The human didn't reach to help her. He simply waited. Watching her movements carefully, she stepped out from behind the wall, her eyes darting to the bodies of the enemy soldiers he had killed. Their weapons lay scattered, but the human ignored them. Instead, he scanned the street. Moving with slow, controlled steps, he gestured for her to follow. Every instinct told her this was a mistake. Humans could not be trusted. The stories from her people were clear. Humans fought for themselves. They destroyed everything in their way. Yet here he was, walking ahead of her, his rifle pointed outward. Protecting their path, she wanted to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she kept her distance, trailing behind him. If he decided to turn on her, she wanted space to run. Though deep down she knew she would never outrun him. They moved through the ruins, stepping over fallen beams and broken walls. The wind carried the smell of ash and oil. Somewhere far off, she heard a deep rumble. Maybe tanks, maybe incoming ships. The war was still going on, and it was getting closer. The human stopped suddenly. Raising his hand for her to halt, she froze, scanning the shadows. Then she heard it footsteps, fast and many. The enemy? They were still searching, still hunting. He crouched behind a collapsed pillar, his eyes meeting hers. "Stay low, keep behind me," he whispered. She felt a strange pull in her chest. This was not a command meant to trap her, was a warning to keep her alive. The enemy patrol passed close, their weapons ready. She held her breath, feeling the cold edge of fear pressing into her ribs. One wrong move, one sound, and they would be dead. The human waited until the last soldier was out of sight before motioning for her to move again. They slipped through the back streets, keeping to the shadows. He never once looked away from their surroundings. His attention wasn't on hurt, was on the danger ahead, as if her safety was already his responsibility. They finally stopped in a narrow alley, blocked on both ends by rubble. For the first time since they met, he looked directly at her and spoke without urgency. "My name's Mason," he said. "Captain Mason." She stared at him for a moment, unsure what to do with the information. Names meant trust, and trust was dangerous, but something about him saying it so openly made her pause. "I'm Liara," she said quietly. The sound of her own voice startled her. She hadn't introduced herself to anyone in years. Kaysen gave a short nod. "We can't stay here long. There's an old shelter in the east sector. I'm taking you there." She frowned. "Why?" His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but as if the question confused him. "Because you won't last out here alone," he said. She didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to her like that since the war began. Everyone else had either ordered her around, ignored her, or tried to use her. But this human, he sounded like he actually cared. They rested for only a few minutes before Mason moved again. He didn't rush, but every step felt purposeful, every time they crossed an open space. He positioned himself between her and the danger. Every time she stumbled, he slowed just enough for her to catch up. The sun was dipping lower, and the shadows grew long, somewhere above. A distant aircraft roared past. Mason glanced upward, then pulled her into the cover of an abandoned building. Inside, the air was cooler. The broken windows let in thin streams. A fading light Mason checked every corner before lowering his weapon. She stood near the doorway, watching him work. He was methodical, never careless. When he finally turned to her, his voice was steady. "We'll stay here until night. Then we move." Lyra nodded, still unsure of what to make of him. The enemy was still out there, and she knew they could be found at any moment. But for now, in this small pocket of safety, she realized something strange. Her fear of the human was starting to fade, not disappear, but shift into something else. Something she didn't yet have a name for. The building was quiet, but not safe. Lyra could feel it in her bones. The walls were cracked. The ceiling sagged, and dust drifted down every time the wind outside shook the structure. She stood near the doorway, still watching the human Captain Mason move with a careful, deliberate pace. He checked every shadow, every broken corner, opening doors slowly and scanning the rooms before stepping in. She noticed he never turned his back to her completely, but he also never pointed his weapon at her. That balance confused her. It was like he didn't trust her entirely, but didn't see her as a threat either. When he was done, he returned to where she stood and closed the door, wedging a piece of metal against it that should hold for now, he said. His tone was calm, as if this kind of danger was normal for him. She wanted to ask him why he was doing this, why he was keeping her alive, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, she lowered herself to sit against the wall. Her legs ached from walking. Her arms still shook from the fear earlier. Mason pulled a small metal flask from his pack and handed it to her. She looked at it suspiciously. He nodded. "It's just water." Her throat burned from thirst, so she took it. The water was warm, but it felt like the best thing she had tasted in months. She drank slowly, forcing herself not to gulp it all down. When she handed it back, he didn't say anything, just capped it and set it aside. From the corner of her eye, she saw him pull a blanket from his bag. It was small and worn, but he walked over and placed it beside her. "You'll need it. Nights get cold here." She stared at it, stunned. No one had given her something without asking for anything in return for as long as she could remember. In her world, kindness always had a cost. But this was different. The air outside grew darker, and the ruined city seemed to sink into silence. Somewhere far away, she heard the faint hum of enemy patrols. Mason sat near the door, rifle across his lap, eyes always scanning the shadows beyond. He wasn't resting, he was guarding. She watched him for a long time, trying to understand. He could have left her to die in the streets. He could have used her as bait. But instead, he had fought for her, walked with her, shared his water, and now was keeping watch so she could rest. It made no sense. Humans weren't supposed to care about others, least not about people like her. She pulled the blanket closer around herself, feeling the rough fabric against her skin. For a moment, she let herself lean back against the wall and close her eyes. The faint sound of the wind outside was almost enough to lull her into sleep. But then Mason spoke, his voice low. "How long have you been on your own?" Her eyes opened slowly. She hesitated before answering. "Months," she said. "Maybe longer." I stopped counting. He didn't respond right away. His gaze stayed on the doorway, but his jaw tightened, as if her words stirred something in him. "You shouldn't have made it this far," he said finally. His voice wasn't mocking. It was almost pressed. She gave a small, bitter laugh. "I didn't make it because I'm strong. I made it because I'm lucky." He shook his head. "Luck runs out. Strength doesn't." The words stuck in her mind. No one had ever told her something like that before. Hours passed slowly. The fire Mason lit was small, just enough to give off warmth without drawing too much light in the flickering glow. She could see his face more clearly, sharp features, a faint scar along his cheek, and eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. Her people had told stories about human eyes, that they could look right through you, see things you didn't want to show. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. When the cold crept deeper into the room, Mason got up and moved closer to the fire. He glanced at her once, then at the blanket. "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." She almost asked him why again, but instead, she just nodded and lay down. The floor was hard, but the blanket made it bearable. The sound of his slow, steady breathing became oddly comforting. For the first time in months, she didn't fall asleep wondering if she would wake up. Instead, she fell asleep wondering who this human really was. The fire burned low, casting soft light over the broken walls. Outside, the city was silent except for the distant echo of engines far above. Liara lay still under the blanket, but she wasn't sleeping. The warmth of the fire was not enough to quiet the questions in her mind. She could see Mason sitting near the door, his rifle balanced across his knees. His eyes were fixed on the shadows beyond. But she noticed he rarely blinked. It was like he had learned long ago that danger waited for the smallest mistake. The flicker of the firelight touched his face, and for the first time, she saw him without the heavy shadows of the ruins. His hair was short and dark. Streaked with dust, his jaw was strong, and a faint scar curved along his cheekbone. It was the face of someone who had seen too much war. She found herself speaking before she could stop. "Why did you save me?" His eyes shifted to her slowly. Not in surprise, but as if he had been expecting the question. For a moment, he didn't answer. The fire crackled softly between them. Finally, he shrugged. "Because you were alone." The answer made her frown. "A lot of people are alone." She said, "You don't save all of them." Mason's gaze held hers for a few seconds. "No," he said quietly. "I save the ones I can." She didn't know how to respond to that. It was not the answer she had imagined. She thought he might say he needed her for information, or that it was part of his mission, but there was no calculation in his words, just something simple. The firelight danced in the dark room, painting their faces in golden shadow. Liara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't sure if she felt warmer from the fire or from the strange feeling in her chest. "You've lost people, haven't you?" she asked suddenly. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the stillness. Mason's eyes flickered for just a moment. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "Too many." Something in his tone told her not to ask for names. She didn't. She knew that pain. The silence between them felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had both seen the same kind of darkness. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Mason tended the fire, adding, "Only a little wood at a time so the smoke wouldn't be noticed from outside." Liara watched the flames, her thoughts pulling her back to the faces of those she had lost. It hurt to think about them, but it also reminded her why she was still alive. Her people had told her humans were cold, ruthless, and selfish, but this man sitting across from her didn't fit that image. He could have left her, could have ignored her, but instead he had fought for her, carried water for her, and now kept watch while she rested. It was dangerous. This feeling, trust, could be a trap. And she had learned to avoid it. But every time Mason spoke, every time he shielded her from danger, it chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. A sound outside broke the quiet metal, shifting against stone. Mason's head turned instantly. His rifle lifting without a sound, Liara tensed, her hand going to the blanket like it could shield her from bullets. They waited. The sound didn't come again. But Mason didn't lower his weapon for a long moment. Only when he was certain it was nothing did he glance back at her. "Stay ready," he said. She gave a small nod, realizing she was starting to believe that as long as he was there, she might actually have a chance to survive. As the night grew colder, Mason shifted so he sat closer to the fire. The warmth lit up the side of his face, and Liara found herself studying the way the light softened his hard features. She didn't know why she cared, but she couldn't look away. "Tomorrow," he said, "we move at first light. The east sector should still have an intact shelter. If it's safe, you can stay there until the fighting moves on. And what about you?" she asked before she could stop herself. He gave a faint smile. I keep moving. The thought of him leaving unsettled her more than she expected. She didn't know why. He was just a human, and she barely knew him. But the idea of watching him walk away made her chest feel tight. She looked back at the fire, trying to push the thought away, but deep inside, she knew the truth whether she liked it or not. Mason had given her something she thought she had lost forever, something she had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The first light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the walls. Painting the dusty floor in pale gold, Mason was already awake. Though Liara wasn't sure if he had slept at all, his rifle was in his hands, his eyes scanning the doorway as if danger could walk in at any moment. Time to move, he said quietly. She pulled the blanket away and stood, her legs stiff from the cold. Mason handed her a small piece of dried food from his pack. She took it without a word, chewing slowly. It didn't taste good, but it filled the hollow space in her stomach. They stepped into the street, the air sharp and cool. The city was still, but the kind of stillness that felt dangerous. Mason moved first, his steps silent and precise. Liara followed close behind, her eyes darting to every shadow. It wasn't long before she heard it, the faint rhythm of boots on stone. Her body froze. Mason's hand lifted slightly, signaling her to stop. They both listened. The sound was coming from ahead, more than one set of footsteps, moving fast. Back, Mason whispered, guiding her toward a side alley. But before they could reach it, another sound joined the first boots from behind. The trap was closing. Lyra's breath quickened. Panic rose in her chest, but Mason's voice cut through it, low and firm. Stay. Behind me, the enemy soldiers appeared at the far end of the street, their weapons already raised. Mason didn't hesitate. He fired, the sharp cracks of his rifle echoing through the ruins. 2 soldiers went down before they could fire back. But more were coming. Go, he shouted, pushing her toward the alley. She ran, her heart pounding. Mason was right behind her, firing in short bursts to slow the pursuit. The alley twisted and turned, narrow walls scraping against her arms as she ran. A shout rang out from ahead. More enemy troops were blocking the way. Liara skidded to a stop, eyes wide. Mason didn't pause. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into a broken doorway. Bullets sparking off the wall behind them, they moved through the dark interior of the building, climbing over fallen beams and shattered glass. Mason's breathing was steady, his focus unshaken. Every time she stumbled, his hand caught her before she could fall. A sudden explosion shook the floor, throwing them both to the ground. Dust filled the air. Mason coughed, then pulled her up. We can't stay here. Move. They burst through the other side of the building into another street. The enemy was still coming, their voices echoing between the ruins. Mason's arm was bleeding. Shrapnel had torn through his sleeve, but he didn't slow. Liara's mind raced. She had seen soldiers before, but none who fought like him. He didn't fight to win glory or to kill for the sake of it. Every movement, every shot, was to keep her alive. They reached a collapsed section of road where rubble blocked most of the street. Mason knelt, pulling a small device from his belt and tossing it behind them. A second later, a loud blast shook the ground, filling the street with smoke and dust. That'll buy us a minute, he said, pulling her forward again. Her legs burned from running, but fear pushed her onward. Mason led her through a narrow passage between 2 leaning walls. Now, the space was so tight she had to turn sideways to squeeze through. On the other side, the air smelled damp. They had reached what looked like an old drainage tunnel. Mason jumped down first, then turned and helped her down. The tunnel was dark and cold, water dripping from the ceiling. Their footsteps splashed quietly as they moved. After a few minutes, the noise of pursuit faded. Mason finally slowed, glancing back the way they came. His face was pale, but his eyes were still sharp. "You're hurt," Liara said, seeing the blood on his arm. "It's nothing," he replied, but she could tell it wasn't true. She wanted to say something else, but the words stuck in her throat. She was afraid of the enemy. Afraid of being caught, but more than that, afraid of what it would mean if Mason fell after another long stretch of silence. They emerged from the tunnel into a hidden courtyard. The walls were high, and the only entrance was the one they had come through. Mason checked the area, then motioned for her to sit. He finally let his rifle rest on the ground and tore a strip of cloth from his pack. Wrapping it around his wounded arm, Liara watched him, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. She had seen soldiers die without anyone caring. Yet the thought of this human falling made her feel like the air was being pulled from her lungs. When he was done, he looked at her and gave a small nod. "We're still alive," he said, almost like it was a victory. For the first time since the chase began, she allowed herself to breathe. The danger wasn't over, they both knew it, but for now, they had escaped. And as she looked at Mason, standing there with his weapon ready despite his injury, she realized something she could no longer deny. She didn't just want to survive anymore, she wanted to survive with him. The hidden courtyard was still, the kind of stillness that felt heavy. Mason stood near the wall, scanning the sky between the crumbling rooftops. Liara sat on a piece of broken stone, her breathing still uneven from the chase. Her legs ached, but her mind was sharper now. The enemy was still out there. She could feel it. They wouldn't give up just because they had lost sight of them. She watched Mason check his rifle, reload, and glance at the tunnel they had come through. His movements were quick and practiced, but there was a weight in his shoulders. "How long before they find us?" she asked. Her voice was quiet. "Not long," he replied. "We move before they surround us." She nodded, but a part of her didn't want to move yet. The courtyard felt almost safe, like a brief pause in the middle of a nightmare. But Mason was right. Pauses didn't last in war. They slipped out through a narrow break in the wall. Entering a street littered with the wreckage of old vehicles, Mason kept to the shadows, making her follow close. Every corner they turned, he raised his weapon first, checking before waving her forward. It wasn't long before the sound of boots returned. This time, it came from more than one direction. Liara's stomach tightened. Mason glanced back at her, his eyes steady. "They've got us boxed in," he said. "We make a stand here." Her heart pounded. "I don't have a weapon," she said, without a word. Mason pulled a compact sidearm from his belt and placed it in her hands. The weight of it was heavier than she expected. She stared at it, her fingers tightening around the grip. "You know how to use it?" he asked. "Yes," she said, though her voice was uncertain. "Good," he replied. "Watch my flank. Keep your head down." They moved into position behind a rusted vehicle. The enemy's voices were growing louder. Boots struck the ground. In a steady rhythm, Mason leaned out and fired first. The sharp cracks of his rifle cut through the air. Enemy soldiers scattered for cover, returning fire in bursts that chipped away at the walls and metal around them. Liara pressed her back to the vehicle, her fingers shaking as she clutched the pistol. Mason's voice cut through the chaos. "Left side now." She turned, spotted movement in the corner of her eye, and fired. The shot rang in her ears. One of the enemy soldiers dropped. She blinked, shocked that she had actually hit him. "Good," Mason called, already shifting to return fire on the right side. Bullets slammed into the vehicle, making the metal groan. Liara ducked low, but kept watching the side Mason had told her to cover. The fight was loud, hot, and close. Dust rose from the ground with every impact. Mason moved like a machine, never wasting a shot. His presence beside her was like a shield, solid, unshakable. Another enemy soldier charged from the left. Liara aimed and fired again. Her arm hurt from the recoil. but the shot hit. Mason glanced at her just long enough to give a quick nod before turning back to the fight. Minutes felt like hours. The enemy numbers began to thin, but the pressure didn't stop. Mason shifted position. Crouching beside her on my mark, we push forward, he said. She swallowed hard. Forward. They're still on my mark, he repeated. His voice was calm but firm. He counted under his breath, then rose from cover, firing in rapid bursts. Liara followed, her body moving before her mind could argue. Together they advanced, step by step, forcing the enemy back. Mason's rifle barked with precision, her smaller weapon adding sharp cracks to the chaos. When the last enemy soldier fell, the sudden silence was almost shocking. Liara stood still, her arms heavy, her chest rising and falling fast. She realized her hands were no longer shaking. Mason lowered his rifle, scanning the street for any sign of movement. When he saw none, he turned to her. "You held your ground," he said simply. She looked at him, unsure how to answer. She wanted to say she only did it because he was there, because something in the way he fought made her believe she could fight too, but instead, she just nodded. They moved on quickly. Leaving the street behind, the air smelled of smoke and dust, and the faint orange glow on the horizon told her the battle was still raging somewhere ahead. Mason led the way, but this time she didn't just follow, she matched his pace, weapon still in hand. The fear was still there, but it wasn't the same. She wasn't only thinking about running anymore, she was thinking about fighting, surviving, standing beside him again. And deep inside, she knew something had changed. They weren't just a human soldier and an alien survivor anymore. They were a team, and for the first time, she believed they could make it out alive. The sun was beginning to set, casting the ruins in shades of deep orange and shadow. The fighting in the distance had quieted, though the occasional boom of artillery still rolled across the air. Liara walked beside Mason now, not trailing behind. Like before, her steps were tired but steady. They had been moving for hours since their stand in the street. Each turn, each alley, had brought them closer to the east sector Mason had spoken of. The shelter, he called it, a place where she could be safe. The word still felt strange. She wasn't sure if it was real, or if it was just something Mason wanted her to believe, but when she looked at his steady pace, the way he checked the shadows without slowing, she almost believed it. They turned one last corner, and there it was. The shelter was hidden behind the remains of a large collapsed building, its entrance low and narrow. Mason crouched and peered inside, then motioned for her to follow. Inside, it was dark but dry. The air smelled of dust and old stone. There were no signs of recent occupation, which meant no enemy soldiers. Mason stepped deeper inside, his footsteps echoing softly. Liara stood near the entrance, unsure if she should feel relief or sadness. "This is it," Mason said finally, setting his rifle down against the wall. "You'll be safe here for a while. There's enough space, and the enemy won't find it unless they're searching every inch of the sector." She felt her throat tighten. "You're not staying." He shook his head. "I have to keep moving," he said. "There are others out there who need help." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had known he wouldn't stay forever, but hearing it made the air in the room feel heavy. She looked at him, trying to memorize the lines of his face, the sound of his voice, the way he stood like nothing could break him. He reached into one of his pouches and pulled something out. At first, she thought it was a small weapon, but when he held it out to her, she saw it was a pendant, a simple piece of metal, round and smooth, with strange markings on it. She hesitated. "What is this?" "It's a token," he said, placing it in her palm, "for luck. My unit gives one to anyone we want to see alive again." Her fingers curled around it. The metal was warm from his hand. She looked down at it, then back at him. "Why give it to me?" He gave a faint smile. Because you're not done yet, Liara, he said. You've got more fight in you than you think. The words struck something deep inside her. She wanted to say something, anything, to tell him what he had done. For her, how he had made her feel like she wasn't just surviving, but living again. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she stepped forward, holding the pendant tightly. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Mason didn't lie. He didn't give false promises. He just met her gaze and said, "If the war lets us." The silence that followed felt heavier than the air outside. He picked up his rifle and slung it over his shoulder, moving. Toward the entrance, Liara followed him to the edge of the shelter. The last light of the sun painted the ruins in gold. He stopped just outside, glancing back at her. "Stay smart, stay alive," he said. Then, with a final nod, he turned and walked into the fading light, his figure growing smaller with every cigar, growing smaller with every step, until the shadows took him. Liara stood there for a long time, listening to the quiet. The pendant was still in her hand, its weight a reminder that she was still here, still breathing, still with a chance. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The war could take everything from her again, but for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't bracing for death. She was holding on to something else, something that made her chest feel warm, even in the cold. Hope, and that hope had a human's face.